political science here at TCU. And one of the things that I want to talk about today are the racial dimensions of human trafficking in the United States. So I have been doing research on federally prosecuted human trafficking cases from the time that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first passed in 2000 to the present. And what I've been doing is collecting all of the cases that I can find that have been prosecuted at the federal level, and I've been coding those cases according to a lot of different criteria. In fact, two of my research assistants who have worked very closely with me on this are here in the back, and they are responsible for coding the vast majority of these cases. But one of the things that we've been coding for is the type of trafficking case that it is, and the specific statutes under which the perpetrators have been charged, the statutes that they were sentenced for, total sentence that they received, but then we have also been coding for a lot of other things regarding the defendants themselves, so their race, their age, their gender, etc. And so I have some really interesting findings that I want to share with you today. But I want to start by saying that it really shouldn't be surprising to us that I am getting the results that I have and that I'm finding what I'm finding. And that's because we have a long history of race-based slavery in the United States, right? And so one of the things that I did for spring break this last year in 2018 was my family and I took a civil rights road trip. And we went to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and we also went to the new Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. And one of the things that both of those museums did really, really well was they grounded the contemporary civil rights movement in slavery, right? And they do that in a way where you simply cannot walk through those museums and see that these two things are divorced. You cannot divorce them. So the civil rights issues that we still have going on today are very much rooted in a system of slavery that started in the 17th century in the United States. And so we obviously know that with transatlantic slavery, there was clearly an issue of white domination and black victims. Though, of course, the narrative at the time was not that these were victims, but they were deserving of this because they were racially inferior, right? And unfortunately, we still have many people that have this view today, that there is a white superiority and that whites are superior in a variety of ways. And this is not just in the United States, this is actually a very global thought, right? That people with lighter skin are superior to people with darker skin. Thankfully, we had the 13th Amendment, right, which outlawed slavery, which is excellent. The problem, of course, with the 13th Amendment was that it has this little clause in it. So it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so here we say slavery is outlawed, legally outlawed, unless it's recompense for crime, right? Unless somebody commits a crime and they go to prison and then they can be legally in servitude basically to the state and forced to do what the state requires them to do. And so we see this play out in a variety of ways. I'm sure many of you have seen the excellent documentary 13th, where they do a great job of showing how this kind of occurred. But what happened was, particularly in the South, of course, they said, well, great, we can get around outlawing slavery legally by just beginning to imprison former slaves, and then they can still do the same agricultural work that they have been doing for us, except now they're doing it through the state and not through us as lords, if you will. So here we have, pictures of black prisoners that were former slaves that were then placed in prison and forced to do a lot of the same agricultural work that they were doing before slavery was outlawed, except now they're doing it for the state. And this, I'm sorry, this is a little bit difficult to see, but we see that this is a particular study that was done in Georgia, where they looked at the prison population in Georgia from 1820 to 1920, and based on race. And what you can see is that really starting with the passage of the 13th Amendment post-Civil War, there was the first sharp incline or increase in black prisoners in Georgia. And then you begin to see, starting in the 1910, 1920, this huge sort of exponential increase of black prisoners in Georgia, especially as compared to white prisoners. Okay? So this idea that the 13th Amendment was passed and we've outlawed slavery is sort of a false notion, given the fact that the 13th Amendment still allows for what we call penal servitude, which is servitude of prisoners. Looking past 1920 and into the present era, we see that U.S. mass incarceration rates of African Americans continues to increase. So this chart is from 1930 to 2010, and you can see that it took another really sharp jump in the 1990s, particularly with the war on drugs, which we'll talk about later as being very much a race-based policy. So this is the percentage of the population of that particular racial population and the percentage of that racial population that is in prison. And so significantly more of the black population in the United States in prison than the white population. So, you know, we have transatlantic slavery where it's a clear case of who the victim is, right? But then we have this sort of morphing into this issue of penal servitude, whereby the narrative becomes these are no longer, you know, victims per se, but they're deserving of the slavery that they're put in because they've committed some crime, which of course was all sort of made up, right? Then we see, interestingly, the passage of this act known as the Mann Act, and many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Mann Act, but it was passed in 1910, and it was also known or called the White Slave Traffic Act, the White Slave Traffic Act. And so the narrative during that time was that there were predominantly white women that were being commercially sexually exploited or prostituted predominantly by black and immigrant men. That was the predominant narrative around the Mann Act being passed. And we see this play out in the way that the Mann Act was prosecuted, at least in the initial aftermath of the passage of the Mann Act. So many of you may know of Jack Johnson. Anyone? Jack Johnson? Who's Jack Johnson, Ralph?
He was a boxer who was convicted under the Mann Act.
That's right. So he was the first African-American heavyweight boxing champion in the United States. He was from the good old state of Texas. He was from Galveston. And he was among the first people to ever be prosecuted under the Mann Act. And what was alleged was that he was prostituting white women, that he had transported a white woman across state lines from Pittsburgh to Chicago. That was the allegation. Now, Jack Johnson had just beat Jim Jeffries, a white boxer, and so that didn't go down very well. He was also acquiring a good deal of wealth at that time, and he was a bit ostentatious with showing his wealth, also not go down very well among, you know, the white population. But beyond that, what was really an anathema to the white population was that he had married 2 white women. Now, this is the 1910s, right? Interracial marriage is not okay. And so many historians have looked at this case and have argued that his prosecution was clearly racially motivated. This was one of his white wives. And that it wasn't so much that he was prostituting a white woman, it was that he was, you know, a black man taking white women. And as a black man, the narrative was, you're a monster. So you're obviously not treating them very well, right? And these are our women. And so many historians have looked at this case and have said this is clearly a race-based motivation of this case. And so, you know, you have the first piece of sort of like major trafficking legislation passed, but it's a very racially motivated piece of legislation. What's really ironic, however, is that, does anyone know what just recently happened with Jack Johnson?
Yes,
What's that?
the president forgave his court case. He got pardoned.
Which I find to be very ironic. I'm not sure if any of you can explain this. Marketing. That's what a lot of the analysis was, that, you know, this is his attempt to, but it's really interesting because, you know, obviously, you know, Jack Johnson has passed away. This is a posthumous pardon. But in the past, there have been certain groups that have requested that President George W. Bush pardon him, and he wouldn't do it. And then Obama was actually asked to pardon him, and he also didn't do it. And then they asked, and actually it was Sylvester Stallone. This is no joke, you can't even make this up. Who called President Trump and was like, you know, as a fellow boxer, like, I really think that you need to pardon Jack Johnson, and so he did. And so here he is. That is his pardon of Jack Johnson. So ironic. I've been really thinking about this and trying to figure out a good explanation. I simply do not have one. So the conclusion, though, looking just like through history at the intersection of race and slavery, is undeniable. But it's also a bit complicated because, of course, it began with blacks as victims of slavery. But then with the passage of the 13th Amendment, it created this new type of justifiable slavery that led to mass incarceration, specifically of black males. And then that led to this notion of black male criminality, right? That still very much is pervasive today. And so then it morphs into this idea that black males are perpetrators, not only of other crimes, but with the Mann Act, specifically of enslaving other people through commercial sexual exploitation. And so you have this very interesting morphing of the intersection of race and trafficking over time. So now I want to fast forward us to the year 2000 with the passage of what's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act sets forth basically, and I'm sort of simplifying this, but basically 3 types of trafficking, okay? The first one is minor sex trafficking. And the way that minor sex trafficking is defined is basically the recruitment, harboring, transporting, obtaining, providing of a person for a commercial sex act. And a commercial sex act is defined as where anything of value is being traded for sex, and sex is also broadly defined, okay? So what this means is that any minor that's engaging in commercial sex, any minor under the age of 18 that's engaging in commercial sex, regardless of whether or not they are being forced by someone else to do it, is by definition a victim of sex trafficking, okay? So if somebody is behind this and forcing them to do it, then that person can get, there's a mandatory minimum of 15 years to life for trafficking someone between the ages of, well, someone 14 or under, and actually someone under 14, so under 13 or under, and then there's a mandatory minimum of 10 years to life for trafficking someone ages 14 to 18, okay? So these are really, really important things. So just, I want you to remember that you do not have to prove forced fraud or coercion in the case of a minor victim in a commercial sex act. and the mandatory minimum, the lowest, is 10 years to life, okay? The second type of trafficking that it defines is adult sex trafficking. And adult sex trafficking is the same definition as minor sex trafficking, recruiting, harboring, transporting, obtaining, providing, etc. But the difference is you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, that these individuals were engaging in these commercial sex acts by being induced by force, by fraud, or by coercion. And if you can prove that, then the sentencing guidelines are the same as trafficking a minor under the age of 14. So minimum of 15 years to life, okay? However, this is really tricky because historically speaking, adults engaging in prostitution are criminals, right? Prostitution is criminalized. And so historically speaking, we think about women in prostitution most often as criminals, not as victims. And so it's very difficult to prove in a court of law force, fraud, and coercion. So although the sentencing guidelines are similar to those of sex trafficking of a minor, the burden of proof is significantly higher in those cases, which therefore sort of de-incentivizes prosecutors from taking up these cases. Not to mention the fact that adult victims of sex trafficking are not nearly as sort of anathema, I would say, to the public as minors for engaging in commercial sex. And then the final type of sex trafficking of human trafficking that's defined in the TVPA is labor trafficking. And so here it's defined the same way where the acts and the means are the same. So providing, obtaining, transporting, harboring, et cetera, by force, fraud, or coercion. And the difference is the purpose. So here it's for the purpose of forced labor or indentured servitude, debt bondage, that kind of thing. Labor trafficking has no mandatory minimum. No mandatory minimum for labor trafficking. And I'm not going to go into all of the complexities of this, but there's a lot of analysis to be done regarding the lack of sentencing guidelines for labor trafficking, who the victims of labor trafficking are in the United States, which is about 97% per my federal prosecution records, non-American, so foreign nationals, and also the vast majority not white. So, it's really important to think about our sentencing guidelines vis-a-vis who we think victims are in certain cases, and when we think perpetrators are more or less deserving of harsher or more lenient sentences based on who they're perpetrating, right? Based on particularly race and nationality. That's a whole other talk that I could give, but for now I'm going to stick to this issue of minor sex trafficking and what we begin to see when we analyze the federal prosecution records with who these individuals are. So first of all, I would say that, I do think that it makes a good deal of sense that we have harsher penalties for sex trafficking of a minor than, let's say, sex trafficking of an adult. I think there's a bit of an oddity that we don't see this differentiation between minor and adult when it comes to labor. I think there's a bunch of political reasons why that's the case. But nevertheless, I think that we can all probably agree that, yeah, violating a minor in that way is deserving of a harsher penalty. Public opinion is relatively united around this issue, and there are other types of criminal statutes that more harshly punish crimes against children, including things like rape, producing and distribution of child pornography, where pornography of adults is protected under the First Amendment, but child pornography is a major federal offense, major felony. So we see this in other types of crimes, and so it's not necessarily inconsistent with what we see, and I think it's probably very justifiable. So the problem isn't the fact that we have harsher sentencing guidelines necessarily for minor sex trafficking than for the other types of trafficking that exist in the United States. The problem is the incentive structures to prosecute those cases end up leading to what we see as being significant racial disparities in prosecuting these cases. So this is a chart of all of the cases, the federally prosecuted cases that I have in my database, which is over 900 of them. And this is from the year 2005 to 2015, so a 10-year period. And what you can see is the dark blue line is minor sex trafficking cases, the gray line is adult sex trafficking cases, and the black line is labor trafficking cases. So overall, between 2005 and 2015, there were 638 minor sex trafficking cases prosecuted, okay? 638. There were 321 adult sex trafficking cases prosecuted in the same 10-year period, and only 83 labor trafficking cases prosecuted in that same 10-year period. So you have over double the number of minor sex trafficking cases being prosecuted in a 10-year time frame than you have of both adult and labor trafficking cases combined, right? Okay, so that kind of makes sense. We all agree that minors are serious victims, and those cases should be prosecuted. And also, we also know that the incentive structures are such that those cases are more easy to prosecute because you don't have to prove force, fraud, and coercion. So all you have to have is a minor engaging in commercial sex, and it's much easier to prosecute. Burden of proof is lower. So there's a variety of things that help explain this.
So a question for you, so if more minor sex trafficking or cases are prosecuted, but are there more children that are being sex trafficked? What are the proportions? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, and the answer to that is we don't know. Yeah, so the answer is we don't know.
But I mean, I'm sure that there's at least some kind of estimation.
I don't actually know if we can, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. However, I will say that I do not think that there is over double the number of minors being trafficked for sex as adults being trafficked for sex. I cannot say that with any level of certainty, but it is my very strong hunch. And so I think that these numbers are representative of incentive structures for prosecutors and less of the reality of the trafficking that's going on.
Yeah, especially if you see 2005, it's a very different proportion,
Yeah.
and I don't think that the
It's
child
changed so
trafficking have a spike.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it's true. We have, and so I say this with a lot of caveats. We have to be very careful drawing conclusions about the reality of the numbers of trafficking based on prosecutions. I am not making any claim at all about the overall amount of trafficking that's taking place in the United States based on prosecutions. There's a lot of politics that goes into this that makes it not representative of the actual reality on the ground. Yeah.
I think something that we see with a lot of our clients as well is that we know that grooming starts very young. So just because maybe they're not being prosecuted until they're adults doesn't mean that didn't happen when they were a child as well. So that those numbers could drastically change if that were to be included.
Right, and so what we do know is that over 80% of women in prostitution were initially prostituted when they were minors. And so it's really hard to make that leap because all of a sudden they turn 18 and they go from being a victim of sex trafficking to a criminal prostitute, right? And so that's another sort of contradiction in our law, and I'm not really sure the best way to address that, but any other thoughts? Yeah.
So in one of our presentations, I'm from Mosaic Family Services, and one of our presentations we give, I'm trying to find a site for it to help give it some legitimacy, but our stats are showing that labor trafficking is actually the majority of trafficking that we see, especially in Texas, but common to the US is also a trend. So they have an estimation of approximately 79,000 minors and youths are victims of sex trafficking, whereas approximately 234,000 workers are victims of labor trafficking. So as you see, the numbers are, of course, they're all widely underreported. So I would kind of, take that with a grain of salt, but in what is being reported, majority is labor trafficking.
And labor is the smallest take on that whole entire thing.
Yes, and I mean, there's a whole panel on labor trafficking later. Gonzalo's on that panel, and he's amazing, so I highly recommend that you go to it. But there's all kinds of, like, I would say racially motivated reasons for why we don't see as many labor trafficking prosecutions. And like I said, I think that's a totally different talk. But yeah, I mean, and also let's just say, like, globally, there is more labor trafficking than there is sex trafficking. In the United States, there is a significant amount of labor trafficking. It is way underreported, and there's a variety of reasons why that's the case, and the labor trafficking panel will go into that. But okay, so the question then is, who are these people that are being prosecuted in these cases, right? So who are these people? And this is what I find to be the most disturbing part, is that these are minor sex trafficking cases, these are defendants in adult sex trafficking cases, and these are defendants in labor trafficking cases. This color right here is black defendants. Okay, so between 2005 and 2015, 57% of defendants in minor sex trafficking cases were black. That compares with 43% in adult sex trafficking cases and 18% in labor trafficking cases. So, the implications are that the cases that are being prosecuted at double the rate of other types of trafficking and carry the harshest sentence are also those in which black males are most likely to be prosecuted. I'm not saying most likely to traffic, right? But most likely to be prosecuted. Yes?
Do you find that black bottoms are more likely to be prosecuted than white bottoms in cases?
Have
In
not
sex
done that
trafficking
analysis.
Okay.
But maybe we should do it together. One of my RAs. Who is starting a PhD program in the fall, so yes, she has been taught well. Okay, so then this begs the question, right? Are black males more likely to traffic minor girls for sex than other racial groups?
No.
What are the victims? I mean, you're showing the defendants in this case. What is the proportionality of the victims in this
For
case?
as far as gender or race or?
Or race?
Oh, okay. I don't know the race of the victims because I'm using federal prosecution records. So I know the total number of victims in the case, and I know for the most part, I know the gender of the victims in the case, but I have no way of knowing. Of the victim, no. And especially if it's a minor sex trafficking case, there's very, very little information about the victims in those cases. Of course, yeah.
How would you have the stats? Are black males more likely to traffic whatever race, a white little girl that are minors, or an
Yes.
Asian little girl, or
Great question.
that? I mean,
We can't know for sure, right? So I would say as a social scientist, right, being very careful about my words and my conclusions and whatever, I would say the answer to that question is we don't know for sure, but probably not. That would be sort of my cautious answer to that question. Why probably not? Well, we have to look at what we know about other crimes, right? And racial disparities in prosecutions for other crimes. Yes?
So you're drawing a conclusion based on race and prosecution. A little disingenuous, I think, because you haven't demonstrated how many potential prosecutions could have been taking place that involved by race that didn't. Does that make sense? In other
It
words,
totally makes sense, but that's an impossible statistic.
but you're drawing a specific conclusion from a one-sided.
Yes and no, right? Like, yes and no. I totally understand what you're saying, because in an ideal world, we would have a, randomized controlled trial
Well,
experiment where I would
what you're
have those
specifically
cases not
saying, though,
prosecuted.
what you're specifically saying, though, is that law enforcement and the judicial system are systemic in the fact that they will only target
I'm not saying only. I've never said only.
But what I'm saying is I think that's quite a broad brush.
All
to
I'm
paint,
doing.
to draw that specific conclusion that that blacks are being singled out.
So I have a question. I'll respond
Okay.
here quickly here. So first of all, I don't think I made any conclusions. I'm showing data, right? This is just the data. I haven't drawn any conclusions whatsoever. All I've said is that it's difficult to understand this disparity in race across the different types of trafficking without thinking about the historical, racially motivated acts that have been passed in the United States, as well as implementation of those laws in the criminal justice system, which I'm going to get to in a second.